הלו, זה לא. שוב. בבקשה. תוריד את זה.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 21 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org. America is well on its way to 1984. More and more of your rights are being eroded in the name of national security. The latest revelations about the PRISM program that looks at everyone's electronic messages came out when Edward Snowden, who worked for the Booz Allen Corporation, released government documents to journalist Glenn Greenwald. Steve Clemens, reporting in The Atlantic, overheard U.S. national security men supposedly joking about disappearing whistleblower Snowden and Greenwald. One was wearing an official National Counterterrorism Center shirt. Disappearing is slang for kidnapping and secret murder, something we thought was only done in gangster-run countries. We're proud to say that Glenn Greenwald spoke several times in Connecticut recently, and we'll be showing some video of his talk at a conference about indefinite detention. We'll be opening the program with video from New York City, where hundreds of people gathered to support the demonstrations in Turkey. They met at Zuccotti Park, which you remember was the site of Occupy Wall Street. Then to Palestine, where a complaint about Israeli settlers coming on private Palestinian land led to, you guessed it, the arrest of the Palestinian complainers. Finally, some remarks about Africa by Patrick Bond at the UNAC workshop at the Left Forum in New York City. Notice here the Greek flag at the rally. The governments of Greece and Turkey have often been enemies, so it's great to see solidarity of the peoples of Greece and Turkey against the 1% of both countries.
הלו. רגע. כן, אני פה? מה קרה? קשה. כן, תקשיב רגע. מי אתה פה כמובן? היי, מה? הנה הוא. תגיד לי, יש לך פלאפון עליך בסוללה? לא, אני... יש לך פלאפון עליך? מה אתה צריך? יש לך... מה המספר שלך? יש שם מספר 052? 4321. מה אתה פה מעשו? הנה הוא בדרך. הלו. כן. ולו ככה סתם? לא. רגע. שים לב אדוני. שים לב. תגיד לבן שידבר איתי במספר הזה, למה אני סוללה? אסור להם לעלות. אני עוצר אותם מיד. תגיד לו את המספר אחי? לא, אל תחתור. אסור לעלות במעלה שלנו. חבר'ה, בוא נהיה רגע בשקט, שנייה, כן. ג'וז'ו, אתה שומע את המספר או לא?
לא,
464. אני אגיד לך דיבור.
תקשר, יאללה ביי. אמרתי לך את המספר, מה תגנו? יוחנן.
עכשיו באו האנשים האלה, רגע.
מה, הוא מגיע, מקלל, עושה פוזות, זה לא...
רק דרך אגב, הוא אמר שאנחנו יודעים לפעמים. בסדר, רק... חבר כושר אני רואה, אתה? לא הייתי אמור להיות פה, אני אמור להיות במתחי השם.
אמרו לכם לא לעלות. מי אמר לי? אמרו לכם לא לעלות.
מי אמר לך?
הרשויות של ישראל? לא, אמרו לכם.
עד הביתי. עד הביתי.
ללמד. בסדר? תהיה רגוע. אמרו לכם עד הטרסה הזאת, עד למדרגה, לא לעלות, נכון?
מי אמר?
אמרו לכם, ישראל אמרה לכם, לא לעלות.
מי אמר? אל תגיד לי
תירגע,
אל תגיד לי בבקשה.
תירגע.
אתה חייל ויש לך מוח גדול. שמתי מוח גדול. יש לך מוח בראש. ביום אני כאן, בלילה אני כאן. וכל החיילים שער יראו אותי בתוך האדמה שלי.
כל יום רואים אותך פה?
בכל יום אני כאן.
שומע? תעצרו את זה אם אתה יכול. תעצרו אותו. וגם הוא עם המשפחה.
מה זה רוצה להגיע? הלו, זה הלו.
שוב. בבקשה.
תוריד את זה. תעצור.
בלי ידיים. הלו.
One of the things this young lady said, who was 15 years old and a sophomore in high school, she said, look, you keep talking about and writing about the way in which our society has changed so radically in the aftermath of 9/11, all of these liberties that have been lost. But she said, for people who are my age, I'm 15, I was 4 years old at the time of 9/11. There really is no such thing as a pre-9/11 and a post-9/11 world. The post-9/11 world is the totality of their political consciousness. What seems extremist to people who witness the transformation has become very quickly normalized for increasing numbers of people. And as every year goes by, more and more people are trained to view it as the normal state of affairs, as something that they, with the idea of fighting against it, would not even occur to them. And that's true not just in terms of these legal issues, but the way we think about Muslims, the way we think about our fellow citizens, the powers that we think the government should have in terms of doing whatever it wants. Each day that goes by that we allow this to linger, the more difficult it is to combat it. So I just want to close by talking about what I think is the biggest implication of this, and really the primary reason why I work on these issues as much as I do, and why I think it's so urgent to get other people to work on them and band together and fight them as well. There are all kinds of implications that we could spend the rest of the day talking about, from allowing the government to punish people for speech, or engaging in massive surveillance, or depriving people of core liberties without due process. Those are all critically important. But I think the really most significant implication is one that's a little bit more difficult to apprehend, but probably the most insidious, and it's this. When you allow the government to transgress the limits that we collectively have imposed on its power, what it really does is it fundamentally alters the relationship between the citizenry and the government. So in a free society, the ideal state is that those who wield political power have a healthy fear of those over whom they exercise their power. They fear what will happen if power is abused. But in a tyranny, by definition, this is true of every tyranny on the planet, those who are citizens fear their own government. They fear the people over whom power is exercised. And the reason for that is because they know that there are no limits to what the government can do to them, because those limits are so easily ignored. And I just want to share, to close, a personal anecdote, again, that underscored for me that theory, but in a very visceral and emotional way that has really stuck with me and shaped so much of how I think about these things. This took place in January of 2010. January 2010 was the first time that I ever wrote about the organization WikiLeaks. I've written a lot about them in the last 2 years. I've written lots of in defense, but this is the first time I had ever written about them. And in January 2010, almost nobody had heard of WikiLeaks. It was before they had done any of their really big news-making leaks. And the way that I came to learn about WikiLeaks was that in 2008, the Pentagon had prepared a top secret report. And in this report, it decreed WikiLeaks to be an enemy of the state. It said WikiLeaks posed a grave threat to the national security of the United States, and it plotted all sorts of ways to destroy WikiLeaks. And ironically enough, this top secret report got leaked to WikiLeaks, which then published it on its website. And the New York Times wrote this very short article about it, about how this strange, obscure transparency group had been decreed to be an enemy of the state by the Pentagon, and the Pentagon was preparing to destroy it. And I just, by accident, stumbled into this short New York Times article. And I remember after I read it thinking, you know, look, any group that has been decreed to be an enemy of the state by the Pentagon and that the Pentagon is actively plotting to destroy is a group that merits a lot more attention and probably a whole bunch of support. And so I went and I researched WikiLeaks, and I saw that they had done all sorts of amazing transparency projects all throughout the world. And I wrote a long article about the promise that I thought this transparency model held for bringing transparency to the national security state. And I interviewed the group's founder, Julian Assange, and posted the interview. And at the end of that article, I encouraged people to go and donate money to WikiLeaks. And I gave links to how they could do that through PayPal, by Bankwire, to donate money electronically to WikiLeaks. Because I knew that they had budgetary constraints, they were sitting on lots of big secrets, but they couldn't process them. And so I encouraged people to donate. And in response to that article, I had huge numbers of people, dozens and dozens of people, in all kinds of venues, in the comment section to that article, by email to me, at events like this, basically say something to me along the lines of, you know, look, I completely understand what you're saying about WikiLeaks. I understand why you want to be supportive of it. I want to donate money to WikiLeaks. But my problem is that I'm actually afraid that if I do so, if I send the money electronically, I'm going to end up on a government list somewhere. Or even worse, can be subjected to criminal liability for materially supporting a terrorist organization. And these were not crazy, irrational people prone to conspiracy theories and wild speculation. Believe me, I can recognize people easily like that from lots of interaction. These were very sober, rational people who were petrified of their own government, who had relinquished their own rights voluntarily because their government had signaled to them that there was nothing they couldn't do to them no matter what the Constitution said. And the reason why that struck me so profoundly is because you can offer all the rights you want on a piece of paper or a piece of parchment. But if you sufficiently intimidate the citizenry out of exercising those rights by signaling to them that those who wield power can do so without limits, those rights become completely worthless. And it's actually a more effective form of tyranny than overtly denying the rights, because people who are paralyzed that way by fear can simply convince themselves that they're not being deprived of anything. Rosa Luxemburg, the socialist activist, said once that he who does not move does not notice his chains. He who does not move does not notice his chains. It's very easy to intimidate people into paralysis while convincing them that they're free. And that, to me, is the state of affairs that has arisen in the United States from this climate of fear that comes from allowing these civil liberties abridgments to take place. So the last thing I want to leave you with, because I'm out of time, and I just want to leave you with this briefly, is, you know, it's possible that if you gather together at a conference like this and you talk about all the formidable injustices that are arising and all the strong and powerful forces behind it, there's this danger that you can sort of spread this kind of gloominess, you know, like, oh my God, I've just listened to all these people talk about all these horrible rights abridgments, and I think I want to go hide under my bed or throw myself off a bridge or something. And the reason why it's so important not to think that way, and it's why it's important for, I think, everyone to think about not just what's wrong, but also what can be done about it, is because if there's any lesson that we should be able to learn from recent history or past history, it's that kind of defeatism is completely ill-advised. The Arab Spring showed that even the most deprived populations can subvert even the most entrenched tyrannies. The history of the United States, for all of its violence and tyranny and rights abridgments, is one of individual groups targeted with the worst kinds of prosecution, banding together and not hoping that their rights are given to them, but demanding and claiming those rights. What all of these events really teach is that any structure that is built by human beings, no matter how formidable or invulnerable it seems, can always be torn down and replaced by other human beings if the right strategies are found and the right passion devoted to it. And that's what this conference is about, is finding those strategies and tapping into that passion. And that's why I'm so delighted to be with you here today to speak, and thank you again for listening.
Congressman Peter King has called for the arrest of Glenn Greenwald. Senator Feinstein, acting as judge and jury, has declared that Snowden is guilty of treason. And there's been character assassination by establishment columnists like David Brooks in the Times, who, without ever meeting Snowden, has given us a full psychological workup, exposing to all his supposed faults. On the other hand, there are 70,000 Americans who signed a petition to the White House in just a few days calling for a full pardon of Snowden. You can see the petition and perhaps sign it by going to our website, thestruggle.org. Besides Obama administration wars in Libya, Syria, and Afghanistan, it's also heavily involved in African wars. This was discussed at a UNAC workshop at the Left Forum in New York City. We'll hear some of the remarks of one of the speakers, Patrick Bond, who teaches at a university in South Africa.
Abayomi mentioned G-Man and Williams and his role in Kwame Nkrumah's overthrow. Williams' successor today, Johnny Carson, Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, said last September, quote, U.S. interests in the continent fundamentally stem from its interest in strengthening trade to help African states grow their economies and meet development needs. The U.S. wants to work with African nations to strengthen democratic institutions, good governance, and efforts to stamp out corruption and to spur economic growth through market-driven free trade principles. So let me just take that on quickly. I need not much rebuttal in a room like this, but we can certainly recall Washington's deregulatory free market support for Wall Street's binge, which in 2008-09 contributed not to growth, but the world's worst economic crash in 80 years. And the 1% took all the benefits from those bailouts that Obama and his predecessor Bush had arranged. But the most flawed assumption, I believe, is one I hope we'll all take to heart, that by increasing trade with and vulnerability to the world economy, Africa grows. You hear that a lot, rising Africa. It's front page of Time magazine, The Economist. A few elites have certainly grown rich from the extraction processes of raw materials, minerals, petroleum, plantation-based agriculture, but the opposite is more true. If we make a simple and quite rational adjustment to gross domestic product, growth, and that is to incorporate the wasting of Africa's natural capital, ghastly phrase of economists, but let's use it for a moment, because now there's talk of a green economy and measuring the natural resources, non-renewable, they get depleted during the looting, the extraction process. And when you do that calculation, Africa is not the fast-growing 6% per year continent. In fact, as even the World Bank will concede when they make a correction to GDP, the continent is declining by 6% a year, not growing. In other words, there's an absolutely irrefutable case that the nature of the extractive industries not just resource curses people and the environment and possibilities for democracy, but weakens Africa economically. And there's a new attention to illicit outflow of capital. Even ex-South African President Mbeki has put a commission together. But it's the licit, it's the legal extraction to the London, Australian, New York, Toronto-based mining houses that we must be very aware of. And that really was where ultimately Obama's role continues. And that means when there's talk of democratization, let's put that into context. That's talk left to walk right. Carson especially has taken the same neoconservative track of George W. Bush. We have one obvious example, which was Egypt's Hosni Mubarak, the dictator who was personally worth $40 billion, and was the recipient of so much of U.S. military aid, the most wealthy African recipient of military aid, but oriented to the military, right? Not to the masses. As Carson's boss at the time, Hillary Clinton, remarked, as the Secretary of State, "I really consider President and Mrs. Mubarak to be friends of my family." And she said this just days before the tyrant was overthrown in February 2011. Our assessment, quote, "our assessment is that the Egyptian government is stable." As a result of her affection for one of the worst of Africa's big men, Egypt's democratic movement, core activists just turned a cold shoulder to Clinton in her visits in subsequent weeks again and again. The coddling of other dictators was signaled just weeks after Obama's speech in Ghana when Susan Rice, whom we've heard such a good critique of from Margaret, announced a New York luncheon with 25 African heads of state. Quote, "We're looking to have a dialogue with responsible leaders about the future of Africa's economic and social development." Obama dined with numerous tyrants from the continent that day. Only a few governments were specifically left off the list, Zimbabwe one of them, Guinea, Kenya, Madagascar, Niger, Sudan, Eritrea. But among the 40 were the Cameroonian dictator, Paul Biya, and his office said, quote, "At the end of the 2.5 hours that they spent together, most of the African leaders left the dining hall visibly satisfied." And democracy and human rights just were not on that agenda. The struggle of poor people to survive ignored. Another attendee was a Gambian president, Yahya Jammeh, a colonel who, after overthrowing a Democrat in 1994, later claimed to have found an AIDS cure. In September last year, came under renewed criticism from activists across the board after carrying out mass death row executions. And as one of the citizens' movements there put it, quote, "Given that Gambia's government uses the death penalty and other harsh sentences as a tool to silence political dissent and opposition, Civil Society Associations Gambia believes that any execution is a further indicator of the brutality with which President Jammeh's regime is bent on crushing political dissent." Asked whether, like the EU did, the State Department would oppose this and have some sort of response, they said, quote, "I think we haven't telegraphed any response at this point." One reason not to annoy Jammeh was the CIA's reliance upon Banjul, the airport there, as a secret destination and refueling site for rendition. I needn't spell out what that implies, but as Sherwood Ross from the Miami Herald has shown, 28 countries in Africa held prisoners on behalf of the US. That's just based on published data. So that's one of the other ways in which the AFRICOM role is becoming important. We shouldn't really have been surprised that Obama fit right into the Bush neocon agenda and amplified it, and as Margaret says, legitimized it. Before he was president, he visited Chad's dictator, Idris Deby, in part to press the case for Chevron, which Deby had just expelled for failing to pay sufficient taxes. Obama had infamously extended red carpet treatment to the oil-rich Gabon's kleptocratic tyrant Ali Bongo 2.5 years ago, in spite of unprecedented repression and corruption. As for Kagame, already mentioned, $800 million a year in aid, and in June last year, protection against possible UN censure for supporting genocide in the DRC. And 5 million people, at least, have died because of warlords seeking coltan and other minerals. And that's part and parcel of the way in which the DRC is being looted by US friends in Uganda and in Rwanda. We can get into more details if you like. Likewise, sending money to US allies in Somalia. Obama put more than $200 million in military aid there, and to the DRC, Libya, South Sudan, and Yemen, in spite of a 2008 US law prohibiting funding because of these armies' recruitment of child soldiers. The Obama administration, according to Human Rights Watch, has been unwilling to make even small cuts to military assistance to these governments exploiting children as soldiers. They're paying the price of poor leadership, Human Rights Watch. So it seems in sum that Obama's only opposed to African dictatorships which are anti-US or allied to China. But if you're a regional power within the sub-regions of Africa, or if you help hunt Al-Qaeda, or if you have substantial oil reserves, you may commit horrendous crimes and still get the prized White House photo op. I have a whole set of the photos from the White House of these dictators. Now, we partly know a lot about this thanks to WikiLeaks, which in late 2010 published more than 250,000 State Department cables. Bradley Manning on trial now deserves our permanent thanks and respect. Because more than your telephone records you're all very concerned about this week, what the WikiLeaks State Department cables demonstrate is how far Clinton, Bush, and Obama promoted, retained, or imposed the undemocratic regimes where these coincide with US interests. Just as an example, we know that a month after Clinton took office, she asked 11 of her embassies in Africa to collect fingerprints, DNA samples, iris scans, email passwords, credit card account numbers, and of course frequent flyer account numbers, terribly important, and work schedules of local political, military, business, and religious leaders, including the United Nations officials. This is surveillance state gone mad. Let me just suggest, though, as so many have already argued, that AFRICOM represents a major threat. Con Hallinan in Foreign Policy in Focus has reported that AFRICOM's track record has been one disaster after another. It supported Ethiopia's intervention in the Somali civil war, we've heard already, helped to overthrow the moderate Islamic Courts Union. It's now fighting a desperate rearguard action against a far more extremist grouping, Al-Shabaab. AFRICOM also helped coordinate a Ugandan army attack on the Lord's Resistance Army in the DRC, Operation Lightning Thunder, that ended up killing thousands of civilians. And then, of course, the Libyan story we've heard of, in which Washington and European powers also misled the South African government to support NATO's bombing. But this is what's critical about it, is corpses of US troops on African soil must be avoided at all costs. We know from the disastrous Clinton administration Somalia mission, that lesson for the Pentagon. So as General Carter Ham, the head of AFRICOM, explained in 2012, Washington, quote, would eventually need an AFRICOM that could undertake more traditional military operations. And he moved his command in that direction. Although not conducting operations, that's for Africans to do.
If you're anywhere near Connecticut, put aside July 13th and 14th. We hope to bring Medea Benjamin to report on the recent Code Pink delegation to Yemen. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.